Okay, let's start talking about fluid and electrolytes and the acid-base balance. So, just starting off here is showing you that within the kidneys, we can actually, this image is showing you that we have an acidic, our body has a pH that's very, very low, so within the plasma it's acidic, so we're trying to acidify the urine. We're trying to get rid of the hydrogen ions, and so we have a process where we have the sodium hydrogen ion exchange taking place, sodium hydrogen instead of the sodium potassium. And as you recall, you can end up with hyperkalemia because of that. So we're bringing the bicarbonate into the plasma, into the circulatory system, and getting rid of the hydrogen ions in the kidney into the urine. This can go the other direction. We can get rid of bicarbonate and we can bring the hydrogen ions back in within those distal convoluted tubules. So if we look at the different classes of acids that we have fixed acids. Fixed acids don't leave the solution. They remain in the body fluids until kidney excretion. So we're looking at sulfuric and phosphoric acids. These are basically generated during the catabolism of amino acids, phospholipids, and nucleic acids. So these guys remain in solution. The fixed acids do. If we look at the organic acids, these guys are going to be part of cellular metabolisms. They are participants in or byproducts of cellular metabolism. So we're looking at lactic acid and ketones that are synthesized from acetyl-CoA. Most are metabolized very, very rapidly, so there is really no accumulation. We produce lactic acid during anaerobic metabolism of pyruvate. And then we have the volatile acids. These volatile acids can leave the body by external respiration, so they're basically involved in breathing. So carbonic acid is a volatile acid. It forms through the interaction of water and CO2 within the system. So if we start looking at the different kinds of acids, so here we have our carbon dioxide, our water, and this is a exchange that goes both ways. So we have the carbonic acid that can form CO2 and water, and then our hydrogen ions and bicarbonate, and we'll talk about this process a little bit more. So we know within our body that homeostasis, our body likes to maintain our pH at about between 7.35 and 7.45, and so if it falls out of balance, we can go into either acidosis or alkalosis. So alkalosis is a pH that's greater than 7.45, and acidosis is a pH less than 7.35. So if we're looking at the changes that take place in the relationship between pH and the parcel pressure of CO2 within our body. So at homeostasis, parcel pressure of CO2 is about 40 to 45 millimeters of mercury, and then pH is, like I said, 7.35 to 7.45. So when we go out of homeostasis, so if your PCO, the parcel pressure of CO2 rises, then the water plus the CO2 is going to form that carbonic acid, which then can dissociate to hydrogen ions and bicarbonate. So more carbonic acid forms, additional hydrogen ions and bicarbonate are released, and the pH goes down. Because of all of these hydrogen ions within the blood, the pH will drop. If your partial pressure of CO2 falls, then the relationship goes the other direction. So your PCO2 falls, your pH rises, so you have the hydrogen ion plus the bicarbonate is going to form your carbonic acid, which is then going to lead to water and CO2 being released. So this removes the hydrogens from the solution and increases the pH. So we'll talk about what takes place when you have either one of these taking place. So if PCO2 falling would be hyperventilation. Rising partial pressure of CO2 would be where you're having very low respiration take place. So this could be somebody who has a broken rib, somebody with really poor posture, they're not releasing all the carbon dioxide out of their body, someone who is in an accident and is hyperventilating, they're losing way too much CO2, and so they will go into an alkalosis state. So if we start talking about the buffer systems, so the different kinds of buffer systems that occur in either the intracellular fluid or in the extracellular fluid, and CO2 is basically going to be the most important factor affecting body's pH. And so if we look at the intracellular fluid, we're looking at, and we know that a buffer is a substance that opposes changes to pH by adding or removing an hydrogen ion. So if we're looking at the phosphate buffer system, and this is it plays an important role in buffering the pH of the intracellular fluid and the urine. It kind of stabilizes the pH of the urine. And then we have the protein buffer systems. The protein buffer systems, so they regulate the ECF and the ICF, as you can see. These interact extensively with other buffer systems within our body. So we have the hemoglobin buffer system, and this is the red blood cells only. And we know that the red blood cells, when they transfer in the hemoglobin, when they transfer hydrogen ions, it can attach to the hemoglobin. And this is only intracellular system that has immediate effects. So your hemoglobin is an immediate effect that takes place. We have the amino acid buffers, and this is going to be all the proteins that I'll show you an image here in a second. And then we have the plasma proteins. Go to the intracellular fluid to buffer. The hydrogen ions go to the intracellular fluid to be buffered by the plasma proteins. And this is a slower process. So if we look at the carbonic acid bicarbonate buffer system, and this is the most important in the extracellular fluid. This one is fully reversible. Let me back that up a second. And so we'll talk a little bit more about this carbonic acid bicarbonate buffer system because it definitely is the most important in the extracellular fluid. So if we're looking at the amino acids in the protein buffer system, we know that the amino acids, if the pH rises, they can release a hydrogen ion to try to decrease that pH. So we have this is a neutral pH here, so we have a hydrogen ion attached here, and so it can be released into the circulation, trying to bring that pH down a little bit. We also know that when the pH falls, this amino acid can then attach an additional hydrogen ion here. You can actually have a hydrogen ion attached to this R group here, and then also this amino acid can be attached onto that oxygen. So the amino acids do play a role in buffering the pH, and then so in alkaline, the amino acid acts as an acid and releases the hydrogen ion, and then an acidic amino acid acts as a base and absorbs hydrogen ions. So it can play an important role in the buffering. And as I said, many of the R groups can actually accept a hydrogen ion also. So if we start looking at the carbonic acid bicarbonate buffer system, so we know that the hydrogen ion, let me get everything on here, the hydrogen ion can associate with the carbon dioxide, forming this carbonic acid, which can then dissociate into CO2 and H2O, which can then be released by the lungs. The hydrogen ion combines with the the bicarbonate ion to form the carbonic acid, which then can be released out of the lungs, or we have the bicarbonate. Once the hydrogen ion has been released, the bicarbonate then can dissociate and combine with sodium, forming sodium bicarbonate, which is going to be your bicarbonate reserve, is going to be in the bicarbonate reserve, which will come into play later. So it's important to have that reserve. So this carbonic acid does not stay in solution very long. It will quickly dissociate either into CO2 and H2O, water, CO2 and water, or into hydrogen ion plus this bicarbonate, which can then go into the bicarbonate reserve. So it does not stay a very long time as carbonic acid within our circulation. So if we add a hydrogen ion in, we have increased carbonic acid, which dissociates, which is then released in the lungs. We also will bring, from this sodium bicarbonate, we'll bring that bicarbonate out to combine with that hydrogen ion to then dissociate and be released from the lungs. So if we start looking at acidosis, so the response to acidosis caused by the addition of hydrogen ions, so we have an addition of a hydrogen ion that takes place. So respiratory response to acidosis would be an increased respiratory rate, is going to lower the partial pressure of CO2, effectively converting carbonic acid molecules to water. So we add the extra hydrogen ion in, we bring the reserves out, bicarbonate out of the reserves, combines with the hydrogen ions, becomes carbonic acid, breaks down, the CO2 and water can be exhaled out of your lungs. We have other buffer systems, as we talk about, the amino acid, the hemoglobin buffer systems that play a role and can absorb some of those hydrogen ions. And then, as we've talked about, it can go to the kidneys, and we'll have a renal response to that acidosis. So it can produce more bicarbonate to go into the bicarbonate reserves. We know that the tubules secrete the extra hydrogen ions, reabsorbing that bicarbonate to replace the bicarbonate reserves. So if we have, that's acidosis. So remember, acidosis, we're trying to get rid of those hydrogen ions. And obviously we have very well functioning lungs and kidneys. So in alkalosis, we have the removal of a hydrogen ion. So we will have respiratory alkalosis. We have a decreased respiratory rate, so we are trying to elevate that PCO2. So the CO2 molecules will form the carbonic acid. We will have, we're trying to remove that hydrogen ion. We have the bicarbonate that will then go into the reserves. In the kidneys, the kidneys respond by conserving the hydrogen ions and secreting the bicarbonate, and then we have other buffer systems that are going to release the hydrogen ions. So the CO2 is not released so that can turn back into carbonic acid, dissociate into hydrogen ions and bicarbonate, increasing the pH of the blood. Hydrogen ions come from other systems. The kidneys will actually hold on to the hydrogen ions and get rid of the bicarbonate. The bicarbonate will come out of the reserves, go into the kidneys, and we will get rid of it. So again, this is the kidney tubules and looking at pH regulation. So we have the three different buffering systems here. So this is the carbonic acid bicarbonate buffer system, and you can see that we have acidic blood. So we're trying to get rid of those hydrogen ions, holding on to the bicarbonate and sodium. And then over here we have the ammonium ions, and the ammonium by the breakdown of glutamine, and again we have bicarbonate, sodium bicarbonate that's formed. And then the response of the kidney tubules to alkalosis, so we're getting rid of the bicarbonate and holding on to the chloride and the hydrogen ions. Again, don't memorize these images, just make sure you understand how the kidneys function to get rid or hold on to those hydrogen ions. So if we have the respiratory acid-base regulation, So this is respiratory acidosis, respiratory acidosis. So we're going to have respiratory acidosis and we're going to have metabolic acidosis. So in a metabolic acid-base disorder, we have production or loss of excessive amounts of fixed or organic acids, and the carbonic acid bicarbonate system is going to work to counteract that. In a respiratory acid-base disorder, so we have an imbalance of carbon dioxide generation or elimination. So when the imbalance involves CO2, we know that it's going to be a respiratory acidosis or alkalosis. When it involves a fixed or organic acid, it's going to be a metabolic acid-base disorder. So the respiratory acidosis, we have hypoventilation causing increased partial pressure of CO2. So the elevated partial pressure of CO2 results in a fall in plasma pH, so we're in a state of acidosis. So we're going to try to increase our respiratory rate to get rid of more hydrogen ions along with that CO2. Remember, it breaks down into water and CO2, so when we exhale we get rid of the CO2 and then the water, which contains those hydrogen ions. The kidneys are going to compensate by secreting those hydrogen ions and holding on and generating more bicarbonate. And then the other buffer systems are going to accept hydrogen ions, and the combined effect is going to be the decreased partial pressure of CO2, decreased hydrogen ions, and increased bicarbonate, and hopefully returning you back to normal pH levels. Now if we start looking at respiratory alkalosis, and as I talked about before, respiratory alkalosis, so we have hyperventilation that's taking place. So the lower partial pressure of CO2, so we have a rise in plasma pH. So we're going to try to decrease our respiratory rate. The kidneys are going to lose or secrete the bicarbonate, holding on to the hydrogen ions, and other buffer systems are going to release those hydrogen ions. So then if we go to see, we have increased hydrogen ions, decreased bicarbonate, increased partial pressure of CO2, and we return back to normal. Okay, so that's respiratory, because we're looking at the respiratory system is able to compensate, and it involves partial pressure of CO2. So now if we start looking at metabolic acidosis, so if we have homeostasis that is disturbed, so increased hydrogen production or decreased hydrogen excretion is taking place. So we have elevated hydrogen ions, results in a fall in that plasma pH. Increased respiratory rate is going to take place, and you have again, the hydrogen ions are secreted, holding on to that bicarbonate, and then the buffer systems accept the pH. Decrease hydrogen, increase and decrease PO2. So this is saying that you have the ability to use your respiratory system with this metabolic acidosis, even though it's not looking at CO2. The respiratory system will still try to compensate. So if we have bicarbonate loss, the depletion of those bicarbonate reserves down here in metabolic, so if we have decreased bicarbonate, so we can end up with the pH falling again because the bicarbonate ions are unavailable to accept those hydrogen ions. So again, respiratory compensation is going to be an increased respiratory rate. Renal compensation is going to be hydrogen ions are secreted. We're going to hold on to the bicarbonate, and then other buffer systems are going to try to accept more hydrogen ions. We're going to have increased bicarbonate, decreased hydrogen ions, and decreased partial pressure of CO2, and then we're going to return the plasma pH back to normal. So metabolic acidosis has a couple of different factors in it: increased hydrogen ions or decreased bicarbonate ions within the circulation. So then if we look at metabolic alkalosis, so we have loss of hydrogen ions and gain of bicarbonate. So again, elevated bicarbonate results in a rise in that plasma pH. So your respiratory compensation is going to be the stimulation of arterial and cerebrospinal fluid receptors, resulting in decreased respiratory rate. Your renal compensation, we're going to try to hold on to those hydrogen ions. The bicarbonate is going to be secreted. And then we're going to have other buffer systems that are going to try to donate those hydrogen ions to our circulation. And then the combined effect, we're looking at increased hydrogen ions, decreased bicarbonate, increased partial pressure of CO2, and then the plasma pH returns to normal. So metabolic alkalosis can be produced by vomiting, and vomiting may cause this. So when we have vomiting, we have a loss of a lot of stomach acids as we continue to vomit. So we, even though we are vomiting, our stomach continues to produce those acids, and as those gastric acids are produced, if you remember back to the production of hydrochloric acid, we have what's called an alkaline tide that's in place, and so it causes bicarbonate to go into the circulation in exchange for the chloride, and so then we end up with a very high pH, leading to this metabolic alkalosis. Okay, so that's the review of fluid and electrolyte chapter. Make sure you use all of these images. That will be very helpful to you during the exam. Don't memorize them, just understand what they're showing.